Let me tell you how I found my brother. You won't believe what happened. The attic was exactly as I remembered it, silent, dusty, and filled with the weight of forgotten years. I hadn't stepped foot in this house in decades, not since we closed it up after my parents passed, but something had drawn me back, an unshakable feeling that I couldn't explain. I climbed the creaking wooden stairs, each step echoing in the stillness. The light from a single bulb flickered, barely illuminating the piles of boxes and old furniture that seemed frozen in time. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe closure, maybe answers, or maybe I just wanted to remember. As I dug through a box marked family, my fingers brushed against an old leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, its once vibrant color faded to a dull brown. I opened it, expecting to find nothing more than blank pages or forgotten notes. But there it was, a folded envelope, tucked between the pages like a secret waiting to be uncovered. My heart stopped for a moment. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was David's, my brother's. I stared at the words. For my brother, my breath caught, and for a moment, the attic disappeared. All I could think about was him, David, my younger brother, my best friend once, the one person I thought would always be by my side. But that was before everything fell apart, before he left, before we stopped speaking. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I unfolded the envelope. It felt fragile, like it could fall apart if I wasn't careful. The paper inside was yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear enough to read. I took a deep breath and began. Dear William, I've carried this regret for so many years. I wish I could undo the pain I caused you. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to face you again, but I want you to know one thing. I never stopped loving you as my brother. My vision blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. Each word cut deeper than the last. Regret, courage, love. I had spent so many years convincing myself that his silence meant he didn't care. But this letter told a different story. A story of guilt, of longing, of a bond that hadn't been entirely broken. At the bottom of the letter was an address, a small town I'd never heard of, hours away. I sat down on an old stool, clutching the letter to my chest as if it might slip away. Why didn't he come back? Why didn't I go after him? I had let my pride and anger build a wall between us, brick by brick. Now, all that remained was this fragile piece of paper and the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The ticking of my father's old clock broke the silence. It sounded louder now, almost urgent, as if it was daring me to act. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something I thought I'd lost. Hope. I couldn't sleep that night. The letter sat on my nightstand, folded neatly, but its words echoed in my mind like a song on repeat. Regret, courage, love. Each one struck a different chord, unraveling years of emotions I thought I'd buried. I kept replaying the memories of David in my head. His laughter, the way he used to call me Will when no one else did, and then the silence that followed his departure, like an unwelcome guest that never left. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through my bedroom window, bringing with them a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or if I'd even find him, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here, trapped by the shadows of what once was. I packed a small bag, took the letter, and set out for the address he'd written. The road stretched endlessly before me, a winding ribbon of asphalt flanked by golden fields and the occasional cluster of trees. The scenery was peaceful, almost comforting, but my mind was anything but. Every mile brought me closer to the possibility of seeing David again, closer to answers, closer to closure. But it also brought a wave of fears. What if he wasn't there? What if he had moved on, forgotten me? Or worse, what if he didn't want to see me? The small town appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower, where people still waved at passing cars and kids played in the street. I pulled into a gas station to ask for directions, clutching the letter as if it were my lifeline. "Excuse me," I said to the attendant, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a slight southern drawl. "I'm looking for someone. David Carpenter. Do you know him?" The man paused, wiping his hands on a rag, and then nodded. Yeah, I know David. Lives out by the old oak grove, past the church. Nice fella. Quiet, though. My heart raced. Quiet, though. The words lingered as I followed his directions, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road to David's house was lined with towering oaks, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight into soft patches. It felt like stepping into another world, one where the past and present seemed to blur together. Finally, I saw it. A modest house with a white porch and a garden that looked lovingly tended. My breath caught as I parked the car. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, rehearsing what I might say. How do you even begin to bridge decades of silence? The door opened suddenly, and a man stepped out, carrying a watering can. My heart stopped. It was him. Older, yes. His once dark hair now streaked with gray, his frame a little thinner. But it was David, the brother I hadn't seen in over 30 years. He looked up and froze, the watering can slipping from his hand and landing on the porch with a dull thud. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched, heavy and filled with unspoken words. Will? His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a lifetime of emotion. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like lead, and nodded. It's me, David. He came down the steps slowly, his eyes glistening. I thought I'd never see you again. My throat tightened, and I had to swallow hard before I could speak. I thought the same, but your letter. I found your letter. His face crumpled, and he reached out, pulling me into an embrace that felt both unfamiliar and achingly familiar at the same time. I could feel his shoulders shaking as he whispered, I'm so sorry, Will. For everything. Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't care. I'm sorry too, I managed to say, my voice breaking. I should have come sooner. We stood there for what felt like hours, two old men holding on to the remnants of a bond that had weathered time, distance, and silence. The porch light flickered on, bathing us in a warm glow, as if the house itself welcomed this long overdue reunion. When we finally pulled apart, David gestured toward the house. Come on in. There's so much I need to tell you. I nodded, following him inside, my heart lighter than it had been in decades. Whatever had kept us apart no longer mattered. We had found our way back to each other, and that was all that mattered. The house was warm, inviting in a way that surprised me. For years, I had imagined where David might be, if he was even still alive. But seeing him now, guiding me into his modest living room, I realized how little I'd actually allowed myself to dream of this moment. The room was simple, yet filled with touches that spoke of a life quietly lived. A collection of books on a shelf, a rocking chair by the window, and a well-worn quilt draped over the couch. David motioned for me to sit. Make yourself comfortable, Will. I'll get us something to drink. I sat down slowly, still taking it all in. My eyes wandered to the pictures on the mantel above the fireplace. There were photos of him, younger but older than I remembered, smiling at what appeared to be a family gathering. A wedding photo caught my attention, a younger David standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Next to it was a picture of a little boy, no more than 6 or 7, holding a fishing rod with pride. Who's this? I asked when David returned, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He followed my gaze to the photos and smiled, though there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. That's Karen, my wife, he said softly, placing the mugs on the coffee table. And the boy, that's Benjamin, my son. I felt a pang of guilt and sadness. You have a son? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. David nodded, sitting across from me. Had. Benjamin passed away years ago. He was just 14. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. I looked at David, his face etched with years of pain and resilience, and suddenly felt the enormity of the time we had lost. How many moments like this had I missed? How many times had David needed his brother, and I wasn't there? I didn't know. I began, but the words felt hollow. Of course, I didn't know. How could I? I had stayed away, buried in my own pride and anger, while David had faced his own trials alone. You couldn't have known, David said, as if reading my thoughts. I never reached out. After Benjamin, after we lost him, I didn't know how to. The grief, it swallowed everything. His voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked away, gathering himself. I wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say that wouldn't sound empty? I should have been there. I finally managed. David, I should have come after you. David's gaze met mine, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, quiet sorrow. We both made mistakes, Will. I should have stayed in touch. I should have fought harder to keep you in my life. But the truth is, I was afraid you'd moved on, that you didn't want me back in yours. The honesty in his voice broke something inside me. I had spent so many years building walls around myself, convincing myself that David had abandoned me, that he didn't care. But hearing him now, I realized how wrong I had been. We had both been prisoners of our own fears, and the years we had lost were a painful testament to that. I never stopped caring, I said, my voice trembling. Not for a single day. For a long moment, we sat in silence. The only sound the soft creak of the rocking chair as David leaned back, staring at the photo of his son. The weight of everything unspoken filled the room, and yet, for the first time, I felt like we were truly connected again. Tell me about him, I said finally. About Benjamin. David's face softened, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. He was the best of me, he said, his voice filled with both pride and sadness. Smart, kind, curious about everything. He loved fishing. Karen used to say he had my stubbornness, and she was right. He never gave up on anything. As he spoke, his words painted a vivid picture of the boy I would never meet but felt as though I already knew. Benjamin's laughter, his determination, his love for life. It was all there in David's voice, and for a moment, I could see the light in his eyes as he remembered. When he finished, there were tears in both of our eyes, but they felt different now. Less like sorrow, more like healing. I reached across the coffee table and placed a hand on his. We've missed so much, I said. But we have this moment, David. We have now. He nodded, his grip tightening on mine. Yes, Will. We have now. It was a simple truth, but it carried the weight of everything we had lost and everything we still had to gain. For the first time in decades, I felt hope, not just for what we had found, but for what we could rebuild together. That night, I stayed at David's house. The guest room was small but cozy, with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess. My heart felt lighter after our conversations, but the weight of the years we'd lost still pressed down on me. Memories of our childhood mingled with images of his son, Benjamin, a boy I'd never met, yet whose presence I felt deeply through David's words. I got up quietly, not wanting to disturb him. The house was still, the faint creak of the wooden floorboards the only sound as I made my way to the living room. The photos on the mantel drew me in again. This time, I noticed one I hadn't before, a picture of our family. It must have been taken when I was about 8, with David still a toddler. We were sitting on the porch of the old house, our mother's arms around us while Dad stood proudly behind. I picked up the frame, running my fingers over the glass. The image felt like a lifetime ago, a moment frozen in time. I could almost hear our mother's voice calling us in for supper, the way David used to tug at my shirt to race me back inside. My grip tightened on the frame as tears welled up. How had we let all of that slip away? Couldn't sleep? David's voice startled me. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. He was holding 2 steaming mugs of tea, his expression calm but curious. Too much on my mind, I admitted, setting the photo back on the mantel. You? Same, he said, handing me a mug. It's been a long day. We sat together on the couch, the warmth of the tea a small comfort against the weight of the emotions hanging between us. For a while, we didn't speak, the silence filled only by the soft hum of the night outside. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It felt more like the calm after a storm, a shared moment of understanding. I'm glad you came, Will, David said eventually, his voice quiet but firm. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I didn't think so either, I admitted. For years, I told myself it didn't matter, that you didn't care. But when I found that letter, everything I thought I knew fell apart. David nodded, his gaze distant. I wrote that letter a long time ago, right after Benjamin passed. I didn't know how to process everything. His death, the distance between us. Writing it was the only way I could make sense of it all. But I didn't have the courage to send it. I wish you had, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Maybe things could have been different. Maybe, he agreed. But I think, deep down, I was waiting for you to find it. Waiting for a sign that it wasn't too late. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I thought about all the moments I had ignored the pull to come back here, the times I had convinced myself it wasn't worth it. Yet somehow, the letter had found its way to me, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. What happened, David? I asked after a long pause. Why did you leave? He sighed, leaning back against the couch. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. I wanted to prove I could be more than just the kid from a small town. I wanted to make something of myself. But life, it doesn't always go the way you plan. He took a sip of his tea, his eyes clouded with memories. At first, things were good. I found work, got married, started a family. But then Karen got sick. It was quick cancer. I did everything I could, but she was gone before I could even process it. I'm so sorry, I said, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. David shook his head. After she passed, it was just me and Benjamin, and he was my light, Will, my reason to keep going. But losing him, it broke something in me. I didn't know how to rebuild after that. I placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. You didn't have to do it alone. I know that now, he said, his voice trembling. But back then, I couldn't see past my own pain. And then so much time had passed, I didn't know how to come back. I thought you'd moved on, that you didn't need me anymore. His words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so many years believing he had left because he didn't care, when the truth was far more complicated. He had been drowning in his own grief, too scared to reach out, while I had been too proud to look for him. We wasted so much time, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We did, he agreed. But we have now, and I don't want to waste another second. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes. I nodded, a small smile breaking through the sadness. Neither do I. We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, filling the gaps left by years of silence. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I truly believed that we could rebuild what we had lost. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and freshly tilled soil. David's house seemed even more serene in the daylight, nestled among the trees as if the world had forgotten it was there. I stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, and watched as the sun rose higher, casting a golden hue over everything. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange calmness, a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I was missing. David joined me a few moments later, his own coffee in hand. He looked more at ease, though the lines on his face still spoke of years of heartache. We didn't say much at first, letting the quiet settle around us like an old, comforting friend. It was David who finally broke the silence. Do you remember the time we tried to catch fireflies in Mason's field? He asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I couldn't help but laugh. How could I forget? You kept tripping over your own feet, and I ended up catching them all. That's not how I remember it, he said, shaking his head. I distinctly recall being the one who caught the most. I raised an eyebrow, giving him a knowing look. You're rewriting history, little brother. He chuckled, and the sound was warm, genuine. For a moment, it was like we were kids again, back in those fields with the whole world ahead of us. But then his smile faded, and he turned his gaze to the horizon. I thought about those nights a lot, he said quietly, especially after Benjamin passed. I wanted him to have moments like that, to feel the magic of chasing something so simple, so fleeting. The weight of his words settled between us. I could hear the pain in his voice, the longing for a life he wished he could have given his son. My chest tightened, and I struggled to find the right thing to say. "He would have loved it," I said finally. "From everything you've told me, he sounds like he had your spirit. Curious, determined." David nodded, a bittersweet smile on his lips. "He did. And Karen, she would have loved you, Will. She always said she wanted to meet my family, to know where I came from. I think she would have liked you." The mention of Karen felt like a small bridge between us, another connection I hadn't expected to find. "I wish I could have met her," I said softly. "She sounds like she was incredible." "She was," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "She kept me grounded, gave me hope when things felt impossible. Losing her, it was like losing the anchor that held everything together." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through so much, David, more than anyone should have to bear. But you're still here, and that says a lot." He looked at me, his eyes glistening. "I'm here because of you, Will, because of that letter. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found it." We sat there for a while longer, the past mingling with the present as we shared stories and memories, both painful and joyful. Each word felt like a stitch, slowly mending the fabric of our relationship. But there was still one thing I needed to do, one place I needed to see. "David," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "do you think you could take me to see Benjamin?" He glanced at me, surprised, but then nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." The cemetery was small, tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by tall oaks that swayed gently in the breeze. As we walked among the headstones, David led me to a spot under a large tree where a simple grave marker stood. "Benjamin Carpenter, beloved son, always in our hearts." David knelt down, brushing away a few leaves that had gathered at the base of the marker. He didn't say anything at first, just rested his hand on the stone, his expression a mix of sorrow and tenderness. I stood beside him, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't mine to share. "He was my world, Will," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Losing him, it felt like losing a part of myself." I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. Instead, I knelt beside him, placing a hand on the marker. "I wish I'd known him," I said. "I wish I'd been here for you. For both of you." David looked at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're here now. That's what matters." We stayed there for a while, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was a moment of quiet reflection, of unspoken apologies and renewed connections. When we finally stood to leave, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Back at the house, the mood was lighter. David seemed more at ease, and for the first time, I felt like we were no longer two strangers trying to piece together the past. We were brothers again, united by the bonds that time and distance had tried to sever but couldn't destroy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I realized how much this visit had changed me. It wasn't just about finding David. It was about finding myself, about rediscovering what it meant to belong to something bigger than my own solitude. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. If you love this story, click on the card to discover more heartfelt and inspiring tales just like this one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading every single one. Let's connect through stories that touch the heart.